Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Mark Etheridge, who is valiantly fighting off COVID to record these podcasts. You can send your thank yous on social media or in the form of a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app or any number of ways to thank him for fighting through it. We are continuing our team preview series of podcasts. Today, we're going to talk about the Georgia Bulldogs. And man, this is going to be a getting to know you episode, I feel like, with the Georgia Bulldogs. A lot of new faces there, a lot of familiar faces just in, a new place in Athens. So some familiarity there with some good players they brought in. So we'll get to all that here in just a second. But first, I have to let you know that this episode of Highway to Hoover and every episode of Highway to Hoover is brought to you by PitchLogic, the system used by players, coaches, scouts, and instructors at all levels of play, from youth leagues to the big leagues. The easy-to-use and affordable technology makes the platform accessible to every player at every level. All the metrics and features used at the highest level. Visit pitchlogic.com for more information. Mark, we getting to know you with Georgia. Obviously, last year coaching changed, Scott Strickland out, Wes Johnson in. Wes Johnson's life was as crazy as anyone's life in late June, as he did basically 2 jobs. And in this era, with the transfer portal being what it is and what have you, that's really kind of, just the only way to do it. But last season, 29-27, overall 11-19 in the SEC. There was a brief glimmer late in the season, early May. They won a series at home against Tennessee that kind of, gave them some hope. I think at that point they were something like 11-13 maybe, or 10-14. That's what it was, 10-14. And, they went 1-5 in their last 2 series, and that was kind of all she wrote. The injuries in the mound just were backbreaking for them. So it was really kind of impressive that they had gotten as close as they did when it was all said and done. And so after the season, Wes Johnson takes over, and it is a completely new, should say completely. It is a very new roster. Obviously, you still have Charlie Condon there, on the short list of SEC Player of the Year favorites going into the season. Fernando Gonzalez is back at catcher. We kind of know what to expect from him. Corey Collins is back. Seems like he's been there forever. But by and large, this is a new team, Mark. And I don't. You probably don't either, but I'll give you the opportunity to. I just don't have a good feel. This feels like A&M to me 2 years ago. And I'm not saying that they're going to go to the College World Series like A&M did in year one with Jim Schlossnagle, but A&M went heavy into the portal that offseason. I went into the season and I'd believe just about anything for this team. And right now, in this roster, I feel the same about Georgia.
Yeah. I mean, certainly this is a team that could, they could play well enough to host a regional, or they could not make Hoover. I think that's how variable it is for Georgia. And obviously the big story is the transfer portal, right? All the new players brought in. But there was one thing that struck me: the projected rotation for Georgia. The top 4 guys are all returnees, right? So that was, I guess I was a bit surprised. You're thinking, okay, bring in all these guys. Wes Johnson, renowned pitching coach, teacher of all, analytics, all that good stuff, right? But there's some talent there in bringing guys back like Chandler Marsh and Charlie Goldstein, who down the stretch was one of the best pitchers, maybe the best pitcher Georgia had. Certainly turned in several good starts. You have Leighton Finley, Jarvis Evans. I mean, there's some guys who had moments, and if they're able to flourish under Wes, then all of a sudden this is a much different team than maybe the one that we saw coming, saw the end of the year last year. And then you throw in all the, the depth pieces that have been added. And who knows, they may not be depth pieces. They may end up being frontline guys, but there's a lot of them. And I think you bring in the volume that they did, and you're going to have some depth out of that. And that, I think that's going to be the interesting piece to me is, Georgia had pitching depth last year. They just didn't have enough quality. And can some of those depth pieces, as we like to say, kids get better. Sometimes new environment, new coach, that's when those things tend to happen. And so that to me is probably the biggest interesting storyline heading in is the returning guys, how much better they get, or if they get better, right? You hope they do. And then the new piece is, what are their roles? And from a pitching standpoint, and then Wes's impact, right? He's impacted every pitching staff he's been involved with. That's kind of what he does. So you would have to expect that will continue even in year one as he tries to juggle head coaching duties along with all of this other pitching stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the pitching staff first, because that was the area where I looked at this team, and I'm kind of with you. I think going into the offseason, now if I'd have sat and thought about it and thought about the guys they might have coming back, maybe I would have come around. But I do think there was some element of just expecting this to be a totally new pitching staff, or at least just a generally new pitching staff. And I too was kind of not only kind of taken aback, like, oh, these are returners, but also I just think because they finished where they did last year, and because it's a rebuilding job, and because they brought in so many new guys, I now look at their rotation. I'm like, actually, I'm probably underrating it a little bit. Like, those guys are talented. Now we can sit here, and there's a reason why we should at least have some skepticism about all of them, right? Chandler Marsh, that's premium arm strength, hasn't really been a starter. We'll see. He pitched on the Cape, and I saw him there and liked him. And obviously last year at Georgia, he was one of their key guys. And so you like that. Charlie Goldstein, you said it, like he was their best, most consistent starting pitcher the second half of SEC play until he went down with an injury of his own. But, it's not premium stuff necessarily. So can he recreate that, next year? So that's the hope. And then Leighton Finley, it looks like it's supposed to look, and talk about guys who were great on the Cape. I mean, he was really good on the Cape, like dominant on the Cape. And I thought, when I saw him in the fall against Kennesaw State, I thought, well, here's your Friday guy, and they've got him slated for Sunday. So, and some of that could just be like matchup based to go righty, lefty, righty, with Goldstein in the middle, but regardless. And then Jarvis Evans, I mean, I saw him against Tennessee, and he was incredible. Super athletic guy with a fastball with life on it. You like a lot of stuff there. So, and then, even if you go to the bullpen, Matthew Hoskins, guy last year dealt with an injury, but that's a high end player too. They were really excited about him going into last year. And so I think the expectations just got lowered to the point that now I look at it and go, well, actually, I'm probably not giving them enough credit for what they have on the mound. So, and because of Wes being there as well, I have to assume they're going to be fairly competitive on that side. They've got talent. They've got a guy leading the team now that, head coach is a different job. I get it, but with his influence, you have to assume they'll get their most out of their guys they can. And then it comes down to just, what do you get offensively outside of Condon? I think we can set our watch to Condon, but and this is where, man, they just got, I remember writing their fall report, and it's like they have 7 outfielders who either have talent that's obvious or were productive players at their previous stop. I mean, and some of those guys just flatly are not going to play. So, So, that I mean, they still might use 15 position players, over the course of the year in some sort of role. But outside of Condon and I guess Collins and Gonzalez, it really kind of is anybody. I mean, Colby Branch is probably locked in at shortstop, and that makes sense. He was really good at Baylor last year, but by and large, I just think there are very few sacred cows in this lineup, to use that phrase, where they're just going to go with the guy they feel best about in that given matchup. And until someone kind of separates themselves, I do think we're going to see a lot of iterating from the Georgia lineup, at least early on.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, a really interesting guy for me is Slade Alford, who's at Mississippi State last year. And he flashed all kinds of talent, just not consistent. And he's a guy that, changes scenery. Maybe he puts it together. And if he does, I mean, it's all SEC ability. Just can he put them together? And then the outfield, you mentioned it, it's such a logjam out there, and who's going to fight their way into the starring roles and who's going to be supplementary guys. That to me is interesting, because you do have people who've been successful elsewhere coming in. I mean, there's not a lot of times you get transfers and they didn't play somewhere else, or they were, but that's not what we have here. We have people who are coming in expecting to play, and because they've been one of the best hitters where they were. So, but this is different. This is the top, the top stage in the sport, and there's a lot of competition, not just with other teams, but within your team to get those ABs. So, I do think that Georgia will be an interesting team to watch early. Their schedule, other than the early season Georgia Tech deal, the multi-venue site deal weekend, is not very challenging. So they'll have some time to kind of figure some things out and do that while you win. A lot of times you're taking lumps in the win-loss column while you're figuring stuff out. I think Georgia will be able to mount some wins, but then their midweek schedule is pretty challenging, which is kind of a weird deal. The weekends aren't that really that tough, but then you look and see all these tough teams, so they're going to need a really good number 4 starter, right, or maybe a couple of them. So I think that's going to be another storyline to watch as Georgia, as we try to figure out what to make of them, especially early in the year. We're not going to know. And then once conference play starts, we're going to need a few weeks just to see, right, as they adjust to the SEC arms and SEC hitters and all that good stuff, just to find out what to make of them. Because honestly, like we said before, they could host a regional or they could miss Hoover. And I think that's, it's so hard when you have a team with that much variability, that many unknowns to, to have any in our role where we're trying to tell you what's going to happen. It's tough, man. I really don't know.
Yeah, don't pin us down on any Georgia predictions this year. That's the one team I'm just gonna say that I'm punting on in terms of predictions. But I am interested to see what they got, because I do have a sneaking suspicion that the sheer volume of guys, I mean, on paper, and I've told, I think I mentioned this to you before off air, I've said it to others, is on paper, a lot of the position players they brought in, it seems inefficient because they've got a lot of outfielders in particular, and a lot of guys who can kind of play second base or third base. Paul Tate's kind of guy, like, who they have penciled in at second base, but could play third theoretically. And I just think that kind of looks inefficient. But I think the flip side of that is that I do think it is a lot of older grad transfers from smaller schools. I think Colby Branch is kind of the outlier. Yeah. Slade Alford, a little bit of outlier, but it is a lot of like guys from, Sam Houston and Campbell and Western Kentucky and places like that, who I think just kind of want the opportunity to prove themselves in the SEC. And I think that can be a powerful thing. So I do have a sneaking suspicion the lineup will be pretty competitive, just because I do think it is going to be a little bit of a fight at the bat rack to get at bats. And so I think that could be good as long as that's channeled in a positive way. I do think that can be good. And you're so right about the schedule. I mean, there's a scenario where they have some sort of relatively gaudy record going into SEC play, and maybe we've got them ranked, maybe we don't. But either way, we're not going to really know.
We don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
and the Georgia
we may
Tech
not know much more than we do now.
Right. Yeah. The Georgia, and if anything, maybe we end up being more confused because maybe some things happen in a way we don't expect. And the Georgia Tech series will be interesting. Georgia Tech also rebuilding, so I'm just not entirely sure if that's, if Georgia gets rolled in that series, maybe that's a little bit of a canary in the coal mine in a negative way, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think I like Georgia's talent more than, and I'm not an expert on Georgia Tech's roster, but I think I like their talent more than I like Georgia Tech's. So, but I just don't know if we're going to be able to read that much out of that series. So,
yeah. Well, one other thing I'll kind of redirect a little bit, but one of the things I've noticed with Georgia, and certainly they went after some of these high-profile transfers, but that's, everyone's going after those, so it's really challenging to get in those living rooms. But one thing they did really well, there's tiers in the SEC, and you can, based on where your program is and where your NIL is and all these other things you want to factor into it. Well, Georgia's not at the very top, right? So But what they are is they're ahead of pretty much a lot of these teams outside the SEC. So if you're able to go in and cherry pick the people you want from those schools, and it really sucks for them, but that's the world we're in right now, and have that, they get upward mobility, like you talked about. They get to test themselves in the SEC, play in front of more scouts and bigger crowds and on the SEC network and all of these things that the kids are interested in. That's a pipeline, man. And if you can get that going, get that established, it's great for the kids, gives them opportunities, and it's good for you, because maybe you aren't getting that Braden Montgomery, but you get maybe two kids who combined can give, can impact your program in a similar way. So I do think that's a good model. If I'm one of these second half of the SEC kind of programs, that you're able to kind of bridge some of the gap between, it's not really haves and have nots in this league, but it's haves and have lesses. And if you're one of those, then this is a great way to mitigate some of that.
It's a good point you bring up, because I think it does bear reminding people. One of the questions I'm sure you get asked a ton, question I know I get asked a ton, is like, why isn't Georgia more consistently good as an SEC baseball program? They've had some high highs. They won a national title 30 years ago, but they just haven't had the consistency. And I think people look at all the talent in the Atlanta metro area, and we don't need to do a whole episode on this, because Lord knows we'd get trapped in a rabbit hole. But I think it's one of those deals where A, it's not as easy as it looks on paper. B, people look at Georgia football and say, well, why can't you do that in baseball? And again, it's not that simple. But then C is the perception was, and look, I didn't, neither of us have ever looked at their books, but the perception was that they just weren't really committed administratively to baseball in the same way. And you look at Foley Field, which is a perfectly good facility, but you compare it to the Mississippi schools and LSU and Arkansas and A&M, and you could go on and on, right? Like, it ends up being a bottom third SEC venue, and by the time it's all said and done, and I say that to say, I do think it is good that, hey, they brought in Wes Johnson, who is like a big name, somebody we always knew was going to get an opportunity at a big time head coaching job, and he chose Georgia. Like, he could have stuck around. He could have been a pitching coach anywhere he wanted to kind of wait his turn on a head coaching job, and he picked Georgia. And there also are renovations coming to Foley Field. So perhaps that is changing. Perhaps Georgia is going to play catch up a little bit, but it was worth mentioning that, like, there has, whether it's totally true or not, there has been a perception of a resource issue at Georgia that has kind of held them back. So we will certainly see how much that worm turns as time goes on. That is going to do it for this episode of Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. We are rolling on with our team preview episode. As you know, we've before this, we have done Alabama, Arkansas, Auburn, and Florida. And eventually I'm going to not be able to rattle those off that quickly. So if you've not gone back and listened to those, please do so. If you're a Georgia fan who just dropped in on us for this one episode, we'd be humbled if you'd give us a shot and get to know your enemies a little bit and listen to the rest of our series. We're going to do one episode for every SEC club by the time we get around to opening day. So we would love it if you'd stick around, and maybe if you'd give us some sort of positive review on your favorite podcasting app. That would be excellent, and we appreciate you. We appreciate you today for listening. I appreciate you, Mark, for playing hurt and being here on this episode of the podcast. And thank you to Pitch Logic, as always, for sponsoring this and every episode of Highway to Hoover. We'll talk to you all